Hey everyone, I hope you've all been doing well. With it being the end of interview season, I wanted to do a quick video about things that kind of helped me get through the interview season, tips and tricks I learned, and things to think about from some of my mentors. So the first thing, of course, is that Zoom is still very much a big thing. I think there were some schools this past year that offered in-person interview options, but the vast majority are very much using Zoom. I know it can be a pain, but for me, honestly, I enjoyed being in the comfort of my own room. I've been working with Zoom, Microsoft Teams meetings and things like that for a while, so that it was actually quite comfortable for me to be doing the interview remotely versus right there in front of another person. And I think another thing that people may not think about is it is possible to have a little bit of a cheat sheet with you, whether like right beside your computer camera or whatever camera that you are using, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But with that kind of getting out of the way, I'm not going to talk much more about Zoom in this video, just because I think there's so much information and so many people have already talked about the Zoom interviews during the 2021 and 2022 cycles. So there's a lot of information about that already. What I mainly wanted to talk about was, of course, how I prepared for interviews and the things that I did. So first and foremost, I think one of the important things to think about is what type of interview you're going to have. It's very easy for you to just do a simple Google search and kind of learn about what style of interview the school utilizes should you get an interview offer. There are going to be three main types, two are more common than the other one. The first one is going to be a one-on-one interview. This is where you're paired up with either a committee member or maybe another faculty member, typically an MD or DO, depending on if you're applying to an allopathic or osteopathic school. The timing for these ranges, but I would expect that it's going to be kept under an hour and wouldn't go more than that, but I may be wrong on that. But from what I've seen, it's typically under an hour. The other very popular option is going to be the MMI, or multiple mini interviews, which is where you get, of course, a mini interview and multiple of them, but they're usually very short on time. So probably anywhere from like 20 or fewer minutes in a room. It depends. I know that there are some where they only give you like 7 or 8 minutes in a room. The MMIs cover a variety of topics. For each room that you go into, they usually kind of give you a prompt before you would enter that Zoom room, whether it be an ethical dilemma, why you chose medicine, or it could even just be a brief interview with a faculty who may ask you 1 or 2 questions. The last type, which I think is becoming less common, is the committee interview, which is where you will be placed in front of the entire, maybe not the entire committee, but a very large portion, if not the entire committee, and they will be asking you questions. That one, very intimidating. I did not personally encounter that, thank goodness, but I know it is definitely not a favorite among people. So when it comes to preparing for the interview, I'm going to break this down into themes and then also questions. So the first part of it, themes, and this is coming from my mentor here at Georgetown, who was, as I mentioned, a great help to me. One of the questions he asked me was, what are 3 characteristics that you would use to describe a physician? And then later on in my mock interview, he said, okay, what are 3 characteristics that a friend would use to describe you? And I, of course, used different terms. I didn't want to overlap exactly, but at the end of the mock interview, he came back and he said, of course, I understand that you don't want to use the same terms, but the terms that you gave me were quite different than the terms that you gave for a physician. And he said, what I'm trying to do is see how your values and how you as a person aligns with a physician and what you think about a physician. And that really got me thinking, so I actually went back after and I kind of mapped all of the traits or descriptors about myself, descriptors about physicians, and how do they connect and how do they relate and how do I fit the idea of a physician technically. I didn't have any questions that came up that were exactly that, but I think keeping in mind how your experiences and your personality fit into the physician role is super, super important and can help you compose really great answers. Now, the next portion is the questions portion, which I think is definitely a little bit easier. There are always going to be hot questions, I will say, or questions that most schools are going to ask you, very common questions. These are things like, why medicine? Why this school? Tell me about a time when you had a morally difficult dilemma or decision, or tell me about a time when you had to go through adversity and how that made you better, how you worked through it. Those are all very common questions. A lot of these you can actually go ahead and answer with things that you have written. So the why medicine, referring back to your personal statement, is a great way to get answers for that. It should not be verbatim exactly what you said in your personal statement, and that would probably take way too long for an answer. You probably want to try to keep it under a minute and a half, but for creating bullet points, it's a great start. Same thing for why this school. I can promise you in their secondary, they asked you why you wanted to go to that school. It's a great starting point for questions. For all of these very common questions, it is a really good idea to not write out a formal answer, but as I mentioned, taking out bullet points for each one. In the moment, it's going to be much easier for you to remember that bullet point and maybe like a couple little subheadings under that bullet point that kind of relate back. And I think it'll help you stumbling less when you're trying to answer that question if you have something kind of already in the tip of your mind that you're going to go through this sequence of things and these are the things that you're going to talk about. It really, really helped me. And referring back to what I said at the beginning, if you're in Zoom, you could maybe print out a sheet. Just saying, you can maybe print out a sheet of these very common questions that you have answers typed up for, and maybe stick it beside your computer camera if you're really, really nervous about it, and so that you can have reference points, because a lot of these schools, because it's Zoom and there's a camera and there's not a person right in front of you, they've told the people doing the interviews not to dock points for not making direct eye contact. So if your eyes slip over one or two times while you're in an interview, probably wouldn't be too big of a deal, but I'm just throwing that out there. The other thing for me that was super helpful for questions is you can search beforehand. It's not a guarantee, of course, just like secondaries. You can search secondary prompts, but there's a chance that they're going to change from year to year. But it's not a bad idea to go ahead and prep answers with that bullet pointing, going back through your activities, finding good connections, and kind of maybe mapping things out for like good, thoughtful answers. Now, another big question bank that you can pull from is more so specific to those MMIs. During other interviews, I'm sure there will probably be one or two ethical questions that come up during the interview, but definitely for MMIs, they love their ethical dilemmas. Now, if you guys took a Casper test, there's probably ethical dilemma banks that you practice with or practice Casper tests, things like that. Those are fantastic resources for those questions. You cannot predict the exact scenario that you may get, but doing any sort of practice Casper or practice ethics, practice empathy tests, those are fantastic for helping you kind of work your way through those questions. Another thing that you'll definitely want to do before your interview is look back over your activities, refresh yourself with what you have written, because I can promise you before interviews, I generally remembered the activities that I put down, but how I described them was not really at the forefront of my memory. So going back through and reading what you wrote about, how you wrote about certain things is super great, because if they ask you a question about research, or if they ask you a question about a volunteer experience, I doubt you're going to contradict yourself, but I think it's a good idea to remember what you had written about that thing so that you can kind of keep in line with what you said already. So the last thing, and I'm sorry about this lighting, the sun, the clouds, the magnolia tree outside my window, they're all playing me today, but we are here doing this. So the last thing that I want to talk about is rehearsing your answers. There's the old cliche of presenting in front of a mirror, just staring at yourself, but it's not a bad idea. It is hard to have access to some of these people who have been on admissions committees and things like I have had here at Georgetown, which is, I understand, very much a luxury. But there are still tons of people who can help you formulate your interview answers. Family and friends, they are great for rehearsing with. They can pick out your cadence, the likes, the ums, anything like that, they are perfect for. The more you rehearse your answers and the more you're comfortable talking around certain topics, the better your answers are going to be. A clear, concise, controlled answer, can't beat it. I know that this has been a shorter video compared to some of my more recent ones, but I just very briefly wanted to kind of get out how I prepared for interviews and went about everything now the interview season is finally finished. It was definitely a learning experience, and interviews are very variable. Here at Georgetown, I was able to talk to other classmates who had interviews, and just hearing the difference between interviewers and our experience, it is highly variable. So with all that being said, to take away from that, just put your best foot forward. Be who you are. I can promise you they would much prefer getting to know who you truly are as a person than talking to a robot. And I know me saying like you should rehearse stuff and da-da-da-da-da makes it seem like you should be like a little robotic, very like corporate and like professional and the way that you talk about things. And that is true to some extent. You want to be very articulate when you're giving your answers and like you've put thought into them. But at the same time, they want to know who you are as a person. They've already read your personal statement, your activities, your secondaries, any updates that you've sent them. They have an idea of who you are, but they kind of want to hear it from your mouth and get to know you as a person. So don't forget that. That is a very important thing. So if you guys have any questions, just leave them in the comments. I will try to get to them, and I will hopefully see you guys next month. Maybe not. It will be finals and I will probably be dying inside a little bit, but you will see me, promise. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and bye.